we hope we're connected to you. So, welcome. We have this really great panel of experts in obesity, sugar, eating behavior, weight loss. And we hope that you'll send us some questions and we'll have a dialogue. So let me introduce you to Kimber Stanhope of UC Davis, who has done the most well-controlled studies of what happens when you give people sugar drinks for weeks. What happens to their metabolism? We have Carrie Butel from UC Davis, who is doing some of the most innovative treatments for helping with overeating in kids with phenomenal results. And we have Ashley Gearhart, our keynote today, who is a pioneer in studying food addiction and what is it in foods that affect our brain to make us feel all that craving and wanting. Barbara Laraya from UC Berkeley, who is a nutritionist and epidemiologist who studies food insecurity and weight during pregnancy and how neighborhoods affect our eating and health. And I'm Melissa Epple from UCSF, and I study stress and all the things that fall apart when you're under stress, like eating well. So welcome, and give us some questions.
All right, so our first question is food addiction a real addiction, and how is it similar to or different from alcohol or drug addiction?
Yeah, so I'm happy to chat about this. That is a controversial question about whether food addiction is real or not, and I don't know if we've quite reached the point whether we have a final answer, but what I think we can say is that the indicators of addiction when it comes to things like alcohol and cocaine and tobacco are really key in eating as well. That loss of control, that intense craving, that continuing to use even though you want to stop and you know it's bad for you. These are behaviors that are really clearly playing a role in eating behavior. Where we're really lacking the science and where we're moving is what foods and what about those foods may be capable of triggering this addictive response. And I would say at this point the evidence kind of points most to refined carbohydrates like sugars, especially when they're combined with things like fat. That really seems to augment how hedonically rewarding and pleasing they are. Now there of course are big differences between food. We need food to survive. We don't necessarily need alcohol or cocaine to survive, although sometimes it can help. Is that we need food to survive, and that makes it trickier because we're in an environment that has far more food cues, and food is in so many environments relative to other drugs of abuse, where if you don't go into the bar, you're going to be able to minimize some of your alcohol-related cues. We also see differences in the developmental trajectory, where kids are exposed to potentially addictive foods much earlier in their life when they're more vulnerable than they are exposed to drugs of abuse. And it really, when we think of our food marketing and our environment and what we think is appropriate for advertising and targeting children for these potentially addictive foods, it can be much more aggressive and less regulated than with things like alcohol and drugs of abuse.
Great. Carolyn McMillan asks, she would love any advice you can give on how to get rid of sugar cravings.
Good question. I think Carrie would be a great person.
Mm-hmm. So part of our work has been to train people to tolerate cravings and to ultimately reduce them. So sugar cravings are a learned response. We didn't come out like this. And so over time what we do is we train people to extinguish that response, meaning that they have it but they don't respond to it. And what ends up happening is that cravings always go up and then they come down. And so really timing how long it takes for your cravings to go up and come down, and then watching it over time, it will be shorter and less intense the more and more you do it. But you have to be willing to tolerate the uncomfortable pieces and just wait for it.
You want to talk about mindfulness?
So one of the things we've done in some of our interventions for helping people with weight and weight loss, either not gaining too much weight during pregnancy or trying to lose weight, is an exercise called Surf the Urge. And it's very much like on the same principle that Carrie talked about. And the idea is what goes up must come down. We know that cravings are like a wave that eventually crashes, and that if we can observe the process and not react and give into it, it will pass. And so we teach people to, in a relaxed state, to be tuning into how they're feeling and thinking, and be able to observe the craving and actually realize it's just a craving. It's strong, it is powerful, it's dopamine in the brain, but it doesn't mean I have to go get that chocolate cake in the fridge. It will pass if I allow it to. And then there's distraction, and there's ways to kind of pass the time so that the craving passes. The hardest way to get over craving is if you're surrounded by those cues of your favorite foods in the house, or so I think cleaning out the environment is a super essential part of managing cravings.
Here's another question. What are products or foods to look out for that contain a lot of added sugar, sodium, or fats?
So I can speak to that a little bit. Added sugars are everywhere. I mean, they really are, when you think about it, the easiest, cheapest way to make your food more enticing than your competitors. And I think we know the obvious ones where you know if you're getting a soda or a cake or candy, you're pretty aware that you're getting some added sugars, but they're hidden in places like ketchup, soup, salad dressing, that they're hidden in so many different places that one of the most exciting, I think, public health changes that's coming down the pipeline is actually listing added sugars on our nutrition labels is going to give people so much more power, especially with actually more realistic serving sizes. I mean, nobody eats the quarter cup of ice cream. I don't know anybody who does. To actually get a sense of what you're getting there. So soon, consumers should have more powerful tools to really know what they're eating, and that might put some pressure on the food industry to reformulate and reduce the added sugars in their products.
One of the ones that I think is most surprising is like the granola bars. And it's like everybody else, they're getting something healthy.
Right.
And then if you look at it, it has the same amount of grams of sugar as a candy bar.
Absolutely.
So you might as well eat a Snickers.
Yeah.
And as a nutritionist, usually we want to use a limit of 5 grams of sugar or less. It's really difficult to find those products that only have 5 grams of sugar or less. But as soon as you're getting to 10, 11, 15, and
28.
28, then you know that you've gone way over a normal limit for
Right,
serving.
but wouldn't you say that the high-fiber granola bar loaded with sugar is going to have less of an impact on the brain and on the glucose surge than the candy bar?
Yeah, it's probably. So the fiber does seem to slow down that sugar absorption. That combo too seems to be important. It might actually enhance our experience of sweetness as when it's combined with fat. And I think, going back to your point, if we look at something like an apple, it has a decent amount of sugar in it, but the way it hits your body and hits your brain is so much slower and less risky that you just don't see people binging on a bushel of apples in the same way they would if it's like caramel apple candies.
Right.
So the quicker the chemical hits your brain, your dopamine receptors, the more addictive. And that's what we know about foods. That's why crack is so much more addictive than cocaine. And that's why these refined sugars can be so powerful to people with certain predispositions, genetic predispositions.
So the deep-fried Snickers bar would definitely be at the...
Very high up there.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually wanted to ask Ashley, chocolate was on your slide as the number one problem food.
Yeah.
Is it also related to cocoa itself?
So there's been some interesting research on that. So there was an idea back in the day that the reason people like chocolate so much is that certain ingredients in cocoa are actually psychoactive. They have this kind of, if you take a lot of it, you might, have a little bit of a trippy chocolate experience. But the amount of cocoa that you need to have that psychoactive effect is really, really quite high. And there was some research done where people actually experienced more of that craving, addictive-like response to white chocolate, which has no cocoa, but it is just sugar and fat. And so when you take that ingredient out, it still is reinforcing. But I think the caffeine effect, when you think of all these additives in food that can even enhance what I think is the core ingredients of carbs and fat.
So Nicole asks, what foods should you avoid if you want to lose weight?
That is sugar. That's a controversial question, but sugar.
So one of the tricks is if you look at all of the weight loss studies, right, the diet that works is the one you'll stick with.
Yeah.
So we've seen weight loss in high protein diets, we've seen weight loss in high carb diets, and so it's not actually the diet per se, at least in our randomized trials. Now, all of that said, earlier we had a discussion about people who respond differently. So there are, I will tell you, in our treatment studies, we actually have people come in and say, I'm addicted to sugar. They identify that way before they even hit us. And so this is kind of a language that's being used. But there might be people that are more sensitive, again, to sugar and fat and the combination in ways that we don't necessarily understand.
Okay, can I ask this question now, and maybe Ashley knows the answer? Long time ago, supposedly the number one common trait of the retainers registry, those are the people that lost massive amounts of weight, at least 50 pounds, and kept it off for more than a year.
National Weight Control Registry.
Right. It was that they planned their own diet. They weren't blindly following somebody else's recipe. Is that still true?
I would say that yes, that the more you can plan, the more effective it's going to be, because our environment, if you are kind of responding just to our environment, that's not healthy. Like, our environment is, the default is to eat in an unhealthy way. Now, I think one of the hard things is that we know that some individuals who struggle more with that planning, or what we call executive control functioning, are a little bit more prone to overeating. So it may be the people who have the most dispositional risk would struggle to implement that. But I think that if you can plan ahead, you can say, you should like eating. You know, you're not going to stick to a diet of like gruel and broccoli tips. Like, it's not going to happen. And so you can actually plan foods to have with you, because when you're stressed or you're tired or you're really hungry, all those kind of impulse cognitive control mechanisms are really weakened. And so being able to have food right there with you that you've planned ahead that you like can be really, really helpful in a way to take some control back for yourself. But it is a lot of work given all the stress we have in our lives.
And we've really learned a lot from the National Weight Control Registry, but remember how many people respond to weight loss treatments and then how many ultimately keep it off. That's a relatively small sliver of the population. I mean, they're teaching us all different kinds of things, but as Ashley said, maybe they have a predisposition to be able to be organized and to do this and those kinds of things. And then if I had some animal colleagues here, they would also say that something about our diet is impacting certain parts of our brain that are associated with hippocampal functioning in particular.
Absolutely.
And our research is suggesting that as well. So, you know, again, it hasn't really been tested in humans, but there's indications that certain diets can impact how your brain functions, thus how you manage your overeating in today's environment.
I just want to add that in a new analysis that we've done using the National Health and Nutrition Administration survey, so NHANES, we looked at what characteristics were associated with a good diet, so getting a high score. And there were several, but getting a high score really meant that the person had to eat very high amounts of vegetables and the fruits, and they also had to avoid or score well on avoiding the sugar foods. So we've often asked the question in nutrition, is it really that we're not getting enough good foods, or is it that we're overeating the bad foods? And this new research is suggesting that we have to do both. We have to be really good at making sure that we have a healthy diet, high in fruits and vegetables and lean proteins, as well as avoiding sugars and the saturated fats.
And going back to some of the animal model research, one thing, a study to me that has just stuck with me so much of an animal model where they had animals and they were eating their chow, like the human equivalent of the fruits and the vegetables and the nutritious stuff, and the rats don't overeat that. They don't become obese. They don't struggle with it. And when the rats were then introduced to M&Ms and chocolate and cheesecake, there were changes in the brain where the reward system adapted to that high level of reward and got used to that. And the chow, which used to be fine, no longer was powerful enough to engage reward and motivation systems. And so these rats would be chilling out in their home cage, like on their rat couch, with like a pile of chow right next to them, no effort, and they would not eat it. But they would go out into electrified mazes and get shocked trying to find M&Ms. And so I think it's really important when I think of the policy implications of this, if this is also true in humans, is just adding more healthy food into our environment without potentially having some policies in place to restrict the availability or cheapness of the really junky foods sets us up to fail, because it's so hard for the junk food to hedonically compete with the health food.
And the new study just out of Minnesota shows just that with a sample of people participating in food stamps or
Yeah.
SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Program, where they had 4 arms. One was a control, one was incentives to eat fruits and vegetables, another to restrict soda, and then one to do both. And it was only both.
Yeah.
Incentives to eat fruits and vegetables, and disincentive to have sugary beverages that they saw in effect.
Interesting.
I actually have always thought that is the best tool a parent can have, is to proactively talk up the fruit and vegetable, reward, hooray, look what we're eating, we're doing such great things for our body. And start that at the age of, 6 months.
Yeah.
So I work with a lot of kids, and so I can tell you that works for some kids and not for others. And I have a colleague who's a nutrition researcher who actually, we had kids together, and she would be eating like broccoli or something. This is so good. This is so good. And one of her kids would eat it, and the other one wouldn't. And so a lot of it has to do with, again, we're looking at the individual differences, and that's, I try to train parents to do that too. But for some kids, they need more than
Oh, I
just
bet.
that. And
I
so
can believe
it's
that.
pretty tricky.
Right.
Claire asks, any advice on triggers? I can go clean and love the feeling, but then as soon as there is a trauma, I go back to old sugar habits. I know better, but can't master it.
Great question.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about this. So one of the things we know from basic learning theory is that once you learn something, it's always there. And when we try to learn new habits, we're just kind of putting new habits on top of the old learning. And when there's stress or when there's a change in the environment or something, the new learning can reemerge. And so I think, saying that you're failing because you're not able to do it long term, but you continually try, is actually not a failure in my book. I mean, that's terribly successful. You can't always fix that if something happens that you're going to emotionally eat. What you have to do is get back on and work to try to control the triggers as soon as possible.
Yeah, I would agree. That's been a big thing in the addiction world as well. Is there's this term, the abstinence violation effect, also known as the what the heck effect. I realized I was laughing. Is that if you set yourself up that there's an all or nothing way of being successful with your eating or with your drinking, and then you have a small slip up, that there's a human tendency to say, well, then I'm just going to finish the whole box of Oreos and then get the cake, or get me that big bottle of wine. And so if you can think about it, just as Carrie was saying, more as like a learning lapse, where you get to kind of learn from that situation and actually equip yourself with more knowledge for the next time that you go up, to maybe have an emotional coping strategy in place, or know that a certain person or a certain situation is particularly triggering for you. Maybe you need some additional support at those moments, can be helpful, rather than that guilt and shame of really beating ourselves up. We don't see that that's particularly effective in motivating behavior change, and just makes people feel more hopeless.
One of our participants this week said, it's not win or lose, it's win and learn.
Yeah, I love
And so I really like that. I was like, I'm sticking with that one. Because that's what it is. When things don't go well, you learn what happened and you try to avoid it, but it's impossible to avoid all kinds of stress. It's impossible.
So stress can actually not just make us crave comfort food, but it also changes how we metabolize it. So there's a new studies out by Jan Kiekelt, Glazer and colleagues, showing that if you've had a lot of stressful events the day before, when you have a high-fat meal, your metabolism actually is slower. So you're going to store it more. And even if you're eating good fats, monounsaturated fats, your body's reacting to that as if it was a McDonald's meal. So it's causing a lot of, eating on stress is causing these fats to cause inflammation, as if we're eating a really low quality meal. So there's all the reason in the world to be thinking about stress as a really big, often invisible, but big factor that's shaping our cravings, our choices, and what our body's doing, how it's storing fat more abdominally, and causing more risk for disease. So that's the bad side of stress. And the good side of it is that we can't eliminate the stressors from our life, but we can change our relationship with stress. So that's a huge focus in our mindfulness training interventions, is to help people respond to their negative emotions and stress in a different way, where they're able to live with them. It's kind of like the surfing the urge example, where you can be okay with these negative emotions without going to passive coping strategies like overeating. And so there's psychological techniques, there's behavioral techniques. Exercise is a huge stress buster physiologically, so it's probably eliminating that inflammatory effect that we get from eating fat when we're stressed.
Is liquid sugar more of a concern, and why?
Well, I'll start with that one. First of all, intuitively, it makes sense that liquid sugar is a bigger problem than the sugar in solid foods, simply because it gets into our blood system and up to our brain so much more quickly than solid food. And many of our hypotheses as to why sugar is problematic relate to how quickly it floods our liver, our brain. However, I will say there is a shocking lack of evidence where we've actually had subjects eat absolutely equivalent diets, but here's the sugar in liquid form and here's the sugar in solid form. To my best of my knowledge, there's only been one study. That study showed a significant increase in weight gain in subjects consuming liquid sugar that wasn't apparent in the subjects consuming jelly beans. But
And who
we
did that
are-
study?
Mattis, Dr.
Okay.
Richard Mattis,
Okay.
yeah. And we simply need more evidence, especially to go further than just weight gain, but looking at the risk factors for cardiovascular
Right.
disease and diabetes, plus the effects in the brain.
Right. And Kimber, what about what you found with small amounts of sugar drink?
Oh, in our studies, it only takes 2 weeks. We can add as little as 1/2 can of Coke to human subjects, healthy young adults, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So the equivalent of 3 half cans spread through the day was enough to increase risk factors significantly in young, healthy adults in 2 weeks. And that was evidence that shocked me. And by risk factors, I mean the LDL cholesterol and the postprandial triglycerides and even uric acid.
Another reason why liquid sugar might, not be as good is because we don't get the same satiety signals. It kind of bypasses the stomach and we don't feel as full. Some research by Jody Stuckey looked at water, sodas, diet sodas, and milk and found that you really didn't get that same satiety signal from sugar beverages as you do from milk, for example. And then you tend to overeat.
Right.
So it's not just possibly the negative effects of sugar from the sodas, but it's also the overeating and eating more calories.
But I do want to caution, that certainly
Sure.
doesn't make parents have a free rein with giving children cookies. you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
We absolutely have to be careful
absolutely.
with all
Yeah.
sources of sugar.
What do you think of soda taxes? Are they effective in curbing the consumption of sugary drinks?
It's a great question. Well, some new research out of UC Berkeley, Chris Mattson and Jen Falby have looked at the Berkeley soda tax, and they've found that the tax it's a tax on not the individual sodas, but on the sugar, and that has been passed to the consumer. So they have seen that the price of soda has increased in Berkeley compared to Oakland and San Francisco, and they are seeing some reduction in consumption. So it appears that there's some shifts, and the Mexican soda tax has shown the same. So I think the jury's still out.
We need all the strategies we can get that are going to improve public health, not just people who have the means and time to come and present for treatment and try to learn strategies. We have to change the environment. One of the things that we're particularly excited about is the ability that institutions have to choose their food environment and how they can exploit that to improve their employees' health. So at UCSF, we have had a campus-wide ban on sugary beverages. So this has been a very long project started by Campus Wellness and others, Laura Schmidt, other researchers, to convince all the vendors to agree and then to implement the ban. And it has gone unbelievably well in terms of people understanding why, so their attitudes are positive. And instead of just bringing soda from home, what we have found is reductions in sugared beverage consumption and dramatic reductions for those who need it most, for those who are the heavy drinkers. So we're very excited about that. We have our students have a poster on that today at our conference that shows that the ban appears to affect people, even those who are drinking usually 2 or more sodas a day. And then what's even more exciting is that on top of that, having a little bit of motivational boost by having a discussion with a health educator appears to boost this effect dramatically. So if it's these little nudges, is not having it at the cafeteria and having a caring person talk to you about your soda drinking habit, if that can help as much as we're seeing here, we're really excited about the potential of these small nudges that we can implement in our schools and institutions.
So Alyssa, talking about small nudges, I was part of a group that did a study at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego, where it was called Rethink Your Drink, and they had sugar displays and this and that, and they classified the drinks as red, yellow, and green again. And I know we can talk about that for hours. But what ended up happening was after we implemented that, the purchasing of sugar sweetened beverages dropped. It didn't go away, but it definitely dropped. So some of the strategies, where you educate people on red, yellow, and green, and then also in terms of where they placed it in the cabinet and those kinds of things, actually reduced purchasing.
One more item about the taxes is when we can use some of the money generated through taxes for educational programs, but also even programs as simple as PE back in the elementary schools, and even fruit available at lunchtime. I have a hard time thinking that could be a bad thing.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being for all of your great questions. You are our first Facebook Live on the UCOP website, and so hopefully you could hear us, and we hope you can watch the rest of the symposium on the Coast Twitter through Periscope. Thanks so much for joining us.